I discovered my wife had been living a double life for our entire marriage, but what she didn't know was that I'm an investigative journalist who specializes in uncovering financial fraud. My name is David. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent the last decade building a career exposing corruption and lies in Philadelphia. The irony isn't lost on me that the biggest deception of my life was happening under my own roof. Sandra, my wife of 10 years, worked as a hairstylist at an upscale salon downtown. We lived in a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and life moved at a predictable pace. Or so I thought. It started with the bank statements. As someone who made a decent middle-class income, I kept track of our finances religiously. Not obsessively, but enough to notice when things didn't add up. In March, I noticed a withdrawal of $1,500 that I hadn't made. When I asked Sandra about it, she smiled that warm smile I'd fallen in love with and explained it was for salon equipment. The hydraulic chair finally died, she said, laughing. You know how old that thing was? I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We'd been married for 10 years, and in all that time, I'd never had a reason to doubt her. But then it happened again. And again. By June, nearly $8,000 had disappeared from our account in unexplained withdrawals. Each time I asked, Sandra had an answer ready. Repairs at the salon, a loan to her sister, an investment in upgrading her station. The explanations were always plausible, always delivered with confidence. That's when the journalist in me woke up. I started paying closer attention, not just to the money but to everything else. Sandra's phone habits had changed. She used to leave it lying around carelessly, but now it was always in her purse or her pocket. She'd started taking calls in the bathroom or outside in the yard. It's just clients being dramatic, she'd say with an eye roll. The real breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening in late July. Sandra was in our bedroom, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Her phone was on the counter, vibrating with an incoming call. I glanced at it instinctively and saw the name Karl flash across the screen. Something about the way my gut twisted told me this wasn't just a client. I didn't answer it, but I made a mental note. Karl. Who was Karl? 2 days later, I got my answer in the worst possible way. Sandra thought I was working late, but my interview had been canceled. I came home early to find her on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a voice I barely recognized. It was softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard. I know Karl. I know we can find him. We will find him, she was saying. Once we have the money, we can hire someone who specializes in this. Our son deserves to know where he came from. My blood turned to ice. Our son? Sandra had always been adamant about not having children. It was one of the few points of contention in our marriage. I'd wanted kids, but she'd shut down every conversation with a firmness that left no room for discussion. I'm not the maternal type, she'd say. I never have been. But here she was talking about a son. I backed away quietly, my mind racing. I went to my car and sat there for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd heard. When I finally went inside, Sandra was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared a salad. She smiled at me like nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to this woman I thought I knew, and realized I didn't know her at all. The next morning, I did what I do best. I investigated. I started pulling together every piece of information I could find. I accessed our phone records, our bank statements, everything. I discovered that the number for Karl had been appearing in our phone logs for months, sometimes multiple calls a day. Then I found the forged checks. 3 of them, made out to cash, bearing what looked like my signature but wasn't quite right. The amounts ranged from $1,200 to $2,000. Sandra had been stealing from me and covering her tracks with forgeries. My own wife had committed fraud against me. This wasn't just infidelity. This was theft. This was forgery. This was a crime. But I needed to know more. I needed to understand the whole picture before I made my move. So I waited. I watched. I listened. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together a story that was so much worse than simple infidelity. Sandra had reconnected with Karl 6 months before all this started. He was her first love, her high school sweetheart. They'd gotten pregnant when Sandra was 17 and Karl was 18. Both sets of parents had pressured them to give the baby up for adoption. They'd complied, too young and scared to fight back. The trauma had torn them apart, and they'd gone their separate ways. Until Karl found her on social media last year. What Sandra didn't tell me was that she'd never gotten over him, or the son they'd given away. When Karl reached out, all those old feelings came flooding back, along with the guilt and regret of giving up their child. They'd started meeting in secret, telling themselves it was just about closure, about finding their son and making peace with their past. But it had become something more. They were planning a future together, a future that included finding their now 20-year-old son and building the family they'd been denied as teenagers. There was just one problem. Karl was unemployed and had been for years. He had no money, no prospects, and no way to fund the search for their child. That's where I came in. Or rather, my money came in. Sandra had been funneling cash to Karl for months, telling him it was from her savings, from the salon, from anywhere but the truth. She'd even forged my signature on checks, justifying it to herself as temporary borrowing. In her mind, once they found their son and Karl got back on his feet, they'd pay me back. She'd file for divorce, and we'd all move on with our lives. She had no idea I knew any of this. And that's what made my next move so calculated. I spent 2 more weeks gathering evidence. I documented every transaction, every phone call, every lie. I made copies of the forged checks and had them analyzed by a handwriting expert I knew through my work. The expert confirmed what I already suspected. The signatures were forgeries, and poorly done ones at that. I photographed bank statements, printed email records, and compiled a dossier that would make any prosecutor salivate. I even hired a private investigator through personal contacts I'd made over the years as a journalist. He confirmed what I'd suspected. Sandra and Karl were meeting regularly at a motel outside the city. They were planning their future while dismantling mine. The investigator also found something else. Karl had a criminal record. Nothing violent, but multiple charges for fraud and theft over the years. He was a con artist, plain and simple, and Sandra had no idea. She thought she was reuniting with her lost love, but she was being played by someone who saw her as a mark. The money she was giving him wasn't going toward finding their son. It was funding Karl's lifestyle, his debts, his next scheme. When I had everything I needed, I made an appointment with the best divorce attorney in Philadelphia. Her name was Helen Collins, and she had a reputation for being ruthless. I laid out everything for her: the affair, the theft, the forged checks, the total amount stolen. "This is more than just a divorce case," Helen said, studying the documents. "This is criminal fraud. We can pursue this through civil court for the money, but you could also press criminal charges if you wanted." "I want both," I said. "I want a divorce, I want my money back, and I want her to face consequences for what she did." This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft from our joint account and forgery. She committed crimes against me. Helen smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "Then let's make sure she pays for every penny and every lie." The first thing we did was freeze our joint accounts. Sandra came home that evening to find her debit card declined at the grocery store. When she called me panicked, I told her calmly that we needed to talk about our finances. She agreed immediately, probably thinking she could talk her way out of whatever I'd discovered. We met at Helen's office the next day. Sandra walked in expecting a conversation. What she got was an ambush. Helen laid out the evidence methodically. The bank statements with highlighted withdrawals. The forged checks with the handwriting analysis. Phone records showing hundreds of calls to Karl. Photos from the private investigator showing Sandra and Karl together at the motel. Sandra's face went white. "David, I can explain." "No," I cut her off. "You can't explain away forgery. You can't explain away stealing over $12,000 from our account. You can't explain away lying to me for months while you planned a future with another man using my money." Helen took over. "Mrs. Thompson, my client is filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and fraud. But more than that, he's filing a civil suit against you for the full amount stolen, plus damages for emotional distress and the cost of the investigation. We're also prepared to pursue criminal charges for forgery and theft." Sandra's hands were shaking. "Criminal charges? David, you can't be serious." "I'm deadly serious," I said. "You forged my signature. That's a crime. You stole from our joint account and used the money to fund your affair. That's theft. These aren't just moral failures, Sandra. They're actual crimes." "But we're married," she protested weakly. "It's our money." Helen shook her head. "Pennsylvania law is very clear on this. Forging your spouse's signature is still forgery. Taking money from a joint account for personal use without the other party's knowledge or consent, especially in these amounts, constitutes theft. And the fact that you were using it to fund an extramarital affair makes it even worse in the eyes of the court." I watched Sandra process this information. I could see the exact moment she realized how much trouble she was in. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "I want a divorce," I said. No contest, no fighting over assets. I keep the house, my retirement accounts, everything. You walk away with nothing. In exchange, I won't press criminal charges. But you will pay back every dollar you stole with interest. We'll set up a payment plan through the court. I don't have that kind of money, Sandra said, tears streaming down her face. Then you'll figure it out, Helen replied coldly. You'll get a second job. You'll work nights and weekends. You'll do whatever it takes. Because the alternative is criminal prosecution, which could mean time behind bars and a permanent criminal record. Your choice. Sandra signed the papers that day. She had no choice, really. The evidence was overwhelming, and we all knew it. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. With her admission of adultery and no contest to the terms, the judge granted the divorce within 2 months. But the civil suit was where I really got my revenge. I'd calculated every dollar Sandra had stolen, $12,467. The judge awarded me the full amount, plus $3,000 in damages for the cost of the private investigator and the handwriting expert. He also added interest, bringing the total to just over $16,000. The judge looked at Sandra with obvious disgust as he handed down his ruling. Mrs. Thompson, what you did wasn't just marital infidelity. It was calculated theft and fraud. You forged your husband's signature multiple times, you stole significant amounts of money, and you did so while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. This court finds your behavior reprehensible. He ordered Sandra to pay me back at $500 per month until the debt was cleared. That meant she'd be paying me for the next 32 months. Every month, I'd receive a reminder that her crimes had consequences. But I wasn't done yet. Using my investigative resources, I actually found their son. His name was Christopher, and he lived in Pittsburgh. He was a software engineer, happily married with a daughter of his own. He'd had a good life with his adoptive parents, who'd loved him and given him every opportunity. Through a contact, I learned that Christopher had no interest in meeting his biological parents. He'd known he was adopted since childhood and had made peace with it. He had a family, and they were all he needed. I made sure Sandra found out. Not cruelly, but factually. I had Helen include the information in the final divorce paperwork. The son Sandra had stolen thousands of dollars to find didn't want to be found. Her entire justification for the theft was meaningless. As I predicted, things fell apart with Karl almost immediately. When Sandra confronted him about his criminal past and demanded to know where the money had gone, he disappeared. Just vanished, probably moving on to his next victim. Sandra tried to reach out to Christopher through social media, but he blocked her immediately. The fantasy she'd built crumbled to dust. The first payment arrived 30 days after the judgment. $500, transferred to my account electronically. I looked at it and felt a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about accountability. Sandra had committed crimes against me, and now she was paying for them in the most literal sense possible. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sandra had to take a second job at a discount hair salon to make the payments. She was working 60-hour weeks, living in a tiny apartment, struggling to make ends meet. Part of me felt nothing. Another part felt vindicated. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. The beautiful thing about the civil judgment was that it was a matter of public record. Anyone could look it up and see that Sandra had been ordered to pay me back for theft and forgery. When potential employers did background checks, they'd see it. When she applied for credit, it would be there. Her crimes would follow her for years. I started over completely. I sold the house, too full of memories and ghosts. I moved into a modern loft downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I threw myself into my work with renewed passion. I traveled to places Sandra had never wanted to go. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage. I lived. Every month, that payment would arrive. $500. For 32 months, I'd received tangible proof that actions have consequences. That you can't steal from someone, forge their signature, and betray their trust without paying a price. People sometimes ask me if I went too far, if pursuing the civil suit was too harsh. My answer is always the same. Sandra didn't just have an affair. She committed crimes. She stole from me and forged my name on legal documents. Those are felonies. I could have had her prosecuted criminally, which would have meant potential time behind bars and a permanent criminal record that would have destroyed any chance she had at rebuilding her life. Instead, I gave her a choice. Pay back what she stole or face criminal charges. She chose to pay. That was her decision, and the consequences that followed were the natural result of her actions. The divorce was finalized. The judgment was entered. Justice, real legal justice, had been served. Sandra would spend the next nearly 3 years paying me back for her crimes. And every month, when that payment hit my account, I'd be reminded that I'd done the right thing. Some people might call what I did vindictive. I call it accountability. The legal system exists for a reason, and I used it exactly as it was intended. Sandra broke the law, and she faced legal consequences. The fact that she was my wife didn't give her immunity from the law. I've moved on completely now. I date occasionally, though I'm careful. My career is thriving. I won an award last year for an investigative piece on municipal corruption. Life is good, peaceful even. And every month, when I see that payment from Sandra, I'm reminded that truth and justice still matter. The last I heard, Sandra was still working those 2 jobs, still making payments. Karl was long gone, probably conning some other desperate person somewhere. And Christopher was in Pittsburgh, living his life, blissfully unaware of the chaos his biological parents had created in his name. As for me, I'm exactly where I should be. Free, successful, and vindicated by the legal system. The 10 years I spent with Sandra taught me valuable lessons about people, about deception, and about the importance of knowing when to walk away. But they also taught me something else, that the legal system, when used properly, is the ultimate form of revenge. Sandra thought she was playing me for a fool, stealing my money to fund her fantasy. What she didn't realize was that she was committing crimes against someone who knows how to document evidence and build a case. You can't steal from an investigative journalist and expect to get away with it. And you certainly can't forge signatures and commit fraud without facing consequences. Sandra learned that lesson the hard way, one payment at a time. Thank you for watching the video to the end. YouTube may no longer suggest my channel to you, so subscribe to it to receive new interesting stories. You will also help the channel grow and improve the quality of its content. A playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to is now displayed on the screen. You can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.